we'll kick it off. Can you see how many people are online? You can't see that? No. So, thank you for coming and spending your lunch with us. We've got an hour again today, and we're going to talk about another brown bag session. The reason they're called brown bag sessions is, as Berenice has got there, you bring your food with you. And it's an informal presentation, I was inspired earlier this week to share with you some of the practices of Agile. Agile is just a collection of practices, and it's fed from the core values and the principles and the practices. But we generally don't want to focus just on the practices. We want to change the culture and the way we think before getting into how to do it. Having said that, I know a few teams I was working with were really struggling about how we do this Agile thing. So at the same time, I thought if I gave you a few tidbits of information, share with you a few ideas, then that can help you along the way. But bear in mind and don't forget, it's all about the values and principles and the core mindset of the way you work in Agile. Today's the second session. This is my last day before I go back to New Zealand for a few weeks, and then when I'm back in December, I'm going to do 4 more, I think it is. Yesterday we did the how and why of Agile. Why would consider Agile, which domain it works best in. And I talked very briefly about Scrum and Kanban and when you'd use the two. That can be recorded. That has been recorded, so it can be watched later on. So I'd invite you to check this out. So before we get going, we've got John Connolly here. And he's going to take Skype questions. So the people within the room, obviously you can put your hand up at any time and we can have a bit of a free and open conversation. For the people remote, firstly, if you're remote and in CO here in Canberra, the first Agile value is individuals and interactions. And one of the principles is face-to-face communication. So I would warmly invite you to come down here and enjoy the party we're having down here. But for everyone else, if you want to send a question to John, Skype him on John Connolly, which is down there. So, the Agile Brown Bag series. Why and how of Agile? We did that yesterday. Today we're going to talk about user stories, how we capture requirements, who does it, why it's structured the way it is, and some techniques such as impact mapping and story mapping we can talk about. So when I come back, we're going to talk about reviews and showcases, agile planning and retrospective. So these are the events in the Scrum framework. So I'll go through each one and explain how to get the best out of those events. This slide deck here is I've taken from the Software Education Agile Fundamentals course, which is an IC Agile accredited course, and I'm an IC Agile trainer. But this is their IP. I'm here through SoftEd. But I thought the best thing to do was just to grab the section we do on user stories and present it to you as a bit of a flavour for that component of the course. It's a 3-day course, and what we'd normally do in user stories takes, I think, about 3 or 4 hours, and we do a few exercises. This here is just the lecture part, so it's about 20 slides, and I'm hoping to rip through them. And in each slide, I'm just going to share with you my ideas and thoughts, and the slides are just a guidance for the pace at which we want to go. Sound like fun? All good? Okay. So, Agile Manifesto. Just to remind you from what we talked about yesterday, this was written in 2001, so over 15 years ago now, and 17 people got together, and there were a bunch of people following Agile practices already. But what they wanted to do was get a manifesto together for the 4 core values and the 12 principles. So they spent a few days workshopping out how can we work differently. And at the time, they were in a bit of trauma and stress because of the dot-com bubble bursting. And so in technology in the US, they said, how can we do things differently? Because this old traditional way of sequential planning and loads of upfront analysis just doesn't seem to be working. So they had these 4 values, and I covered this yesterday. I'll quickly cover it again. It's a heuristic, which means it's a rule of thumb, which means we tend to bias the items on the left more than the ones on the right. It's not to say we completely discard the items on the right, but we favour the ones on the left. So the first one, individuals and interactions over processes and tools. Second, working software over comprehensive documentation. And the interesting thing here, by the way, it says working software, that was 2001. We now tend, in the IT industry, towards solutions. And in fact, Agile is using more and more in non-IT, non-technology contexts. So what I prefer to say, instead of working software, is delivering customer value. So whatever we're doing, we want to deliver value to the customer rather than writing lots of specs about it. The next one, customer collaboration over contract negotiation, and finally responding to change over following a plan. So while we go through the next few slides, I'll refer back to these values and then the 12 principles which are underneath those. And you can read in detail about those on agilemanifesto.org. ShuHaRi. Have we got any martial artists here? Anyone ever done martial arts? There's usually one. Any musicians? What do you play? Right, piano. Piano's a good example, and ShuHaRi actually comes from Aikido, but in anything we do as humans, when you first try and practice something, it feels really, really awkward, and you have to really focus on it, and the part of the brain you're using takes all of your energy and all your concentration. Then you become competent, and over time you can hit the chords, and you know how to do your scales and arpeggio, and it becomes easier and easier. And then after 10,000 hours of practice in many things, in music, in sport, in martial arts, about 10,000 hours, it becomes second nature. And you use what's known as a basal ganglia in the back of your brain, and it's just second nature, the way you're working. It's unconsciously your competence at it. And this is what ShuHaRi means. It was, like I say, originally used in Aikido. Toyota adopted it in their Toyota production system to say initially you need to follow and repeat a set of processes, even if it feels awkward and it's hard and you get it wrong. And over time it becomes habitual and it becomes second nature. And then once you understand the rules and you know how to break the rules, then you can make your own rules and you can elevate above them. So, you know, a prima pianist like Dudley Moore, he could rustle up a real great piece without thinking about it and without reading the music. And that's where we want to become. I know of no Agilist who's in the read state at the moment. We're all in the Ha, we're still feeling our way around. I see a lot of people I help who are in the Shu state, and I've seen a few Shu state issues here where people are really struggling with how do we get going with this. So this explanation I'm doing for you now is Shu, and the idea is if you know how to follow the rules, you follow it like a cookbook, then over time you become familiar with it and you understand why you're doing it, and then you can progress to become more competent. So that's your ShuHaRi. I'm just setting the scene for you at the moment. This drawing here, now this is into what I'm going to explain. User stories, how you write requirements for Agile. In the old way of thinking, in Taylorism, as it was called from Frederick Taylor, if you had a complicated problem, you would break it down into its component parts. You would build the component parts by specialists, and then you'd build it back up again. So when you had a work breakdown structure, you would break it down in logical steps, and then you would isolate those steps. The problem in doing that is that you only achieve any value, and you can only get any meaningful feedback from the customer right at the end. And what we want to try and do is bring the feedback as soon as possible, because that's how we get the information, that's how we can mitigate risk. And this drawing here is a soft-led slide, but it's been adapted from something Henrik Nieberg wrote. Henrik Nieberg is an Agile coach at Spotify. And he says, if you consider building a car, if the customer's not happy with a wheel or a wheel and a chassis, or even a wheel and a chassis and no engine or roof, the customer is only happy when the final product is being delivered. And conceptually, we need to think about a different way of delivering value to the customer. In the second case, you start with a scooter and the customer's, well, it's wheels and it gets me there faster. Then you get a bike, well, it's still wheels and gets me there faster, but I'm still going to get wet. Motorbike, well, it's even faster and it's powered and I don't have to pedal. And it's only at the end the customer's really happy, but at least we're satisfying some level of the customer early. Now, this is a real abstract concept, but it can actually be applied in vehicle manufacture. So if you think of Land Rover, they released the Freelander 2, or was it called the Discovery Sport? And they didn't have the engine ready, so they used the engine from the old car, they had the chassis of the new car, and then 6 months later they had the engine for the new car, brand new engine. And then the entertainment system and GPS came in later. So car manufacturers actually do that. They don't release everything at once. They will sequentially and iteratively release things. And that's the way we should think in the knowledge economy and the way we deliver work. Not all at once, progressively. And so in terms of planning, remember the fourth Agile value, responding to change over following a plan. It's not responding to change over having a plan. We still need to plan. But what we don't want to have is loads of big upfront planning, and we don't do anything until we think we know everything. But on the other hand, we don't want to start with no plan. And many people I've heard say, well, we're Agile, we don't do planning now, we just get in amongst it. And that's mistaken. What we want to try and do is have enough plans so we have a broad understanding of where we're going, and then adapt that plan as we go. And it's the same with the architecture, with the design, but what we want to try and achieve is delivering value to the customer as soon as possible. And there's many levels of planning, starting from the product vision and the product roadmap. And we've been doing some of this with I've seen a few people here who recognise we've been doing the chartering session. We start with a big vision. What are we going to do to change the world? How are we going to impact our customers? And that's the big pictures of the product vision and roadmap. You may break that down into a release plan. So over the next 18 months, we're going to have 3 or 4 big releases and maybe a few smaller releases. And then the iteration plan is once you know what you're going to release in June, you can break it down into the next few months. And maybe for the next month or 2, you break it into the granularity of the next iteration, the next sprint is 2 weeks. And this is what we're forecasting to deliver. So the granularity progressively becomes tighter the closer you are. But you don't want to be spending lots and lots of time doing detailed granular planning of what's the big picture for delivery later on. We want to defer those decisions until later on when we have more information. And finally, there's a daily commitment. This is your daily stand-up, your daily scrum. First, the who. So it's about people, individuals and interactions. And when we create a user story, we've got to ask ourselves, who are we doing this for? And the next slide is on impact mapping, which is focused on who we're doing this for. And so what I do in a chartering session, as well as getting the higher purpose, why we're doing this, the mission and the mission test, and aligning the team, we also spend some time working out who we're doing this for. And we've got some roles here, some profiles and goals. I've tried it with different clients, I've tried different things. So you could have a project room and have a photograph of somebody saying, this is Lindsay, she's an accountant, she gets into work every day late because she's dropping the kids off, she just wants to log on to the work and do it. And you can actually create a life for this person, because then when you're delivering the work you can empathise with that person. So you can have maybe, do the 80-20 rule, the most likely people to use your product, 2 or 3 people. What you can also do is use, one team we use Simpsons characters. So it was a bank and it was a credit card application process. So how would Homer apply for a credit card? How would Ned Flanders? How would Marge? How would Bart? Right, that'd be fraudulent, right? So we'd ask all of these different people how they would apply. And we used characters that we're all familiar with, because then we can go through the journey. I've heard of teams also using the likes of Darth Vader and the Pope, which seems really weird, but if you think about it, it makes you think outside the square. How would Darth Vader use this app? He's got gloves on, he can't press the buttons, you know, that kind of stuff. Maybe he'd use voice control. Well, he probably uses the Force, doesn't he? I don't know. So we've got the role, the person, their profile, who they are, and the goal. What is it they're going to achieve out of this product? And always remember, it's about what the impacts we're going to make for the customer. How are we going to change their behaviour? How are we going to change their life? So that's something I do in a chartering session. I set up the people before we start writing the stories. And this leads on to impact mapping. So there's a guy called Gojko Ajic who compiled or devised impact mapping. There's a website on the bottom there, impactmapping.org. And he works in London. He's a Serbian guy who works in London in the banking sector. And he found out that he would go to a client and they would say, right, we've already started this Agile project and we're sinking under the number of stories we've got. We've got 300 JIRA tickets and we don't know which one to start first. And this is a problem, right? So he says, well, let's break it down this way. Firstly, he asks why we're doing this. Why are we doing this? Is it for increased revenue? Is it to reduce cost? Is it for compliance? Is it because we've got a competitor nicking our product? Why are we doing this product? But then, who is it we're doing it for? So then this is where you have the personas. What is it they're going to achieve? And then how it's going to impact them. So you go through here. And it becomes really easy then, because these whats are your JIRA tickets. This is your backlog. And when you have that conversation, you have a collaborative workshop, and you think, well, we can fix this by just having, say in this case, frequent flyer members buying all tickets. Well, in that case, it's only these two stories here will have the greatest impact. And it becomes really easy to make that decision, because otherwise you're just overwhelmed by the number of opportunities you've got. So I have used impact mapping techniques on a number of occasions in electronics manufacturing, in electronics design, and it's really helped the product owner work out what's the most important next thing to do. So you may want to go to impactmapping.org, there's a bit of information on that, but that's a technique I use. Second is story mapping. Don't be confused, there's lots of mappings in Agile: impact mapping, value stream mapping, story mapping, but they're all different things. User story mapping is, you said we had this hierarchy of features, epics, stories, maybe tasks. What we want to try and do is, by story mapping, I'll just go to the next slide. Where is it? Oh, it comes up later. In story mapping, what we do is we look at which stories are the most important, must have. We can't go online without these products. The parts we should have and the parts we could have. And we put them against a wall. It's a physical board, and we have the main features. And so in each feature, you may have one or two things that you definitely must have. It may be you decide the first release, the minimum viable products, will only have 2 features, or maybe 3 or 4, not the whole thing. And then within them features, which few stories we can have. And again, it's a decision aiding tool. You visualize the work, and you can find that maybe these top 10 stories of these 200 are the things that we need. And if we can go to the market soon with those, we can learn enough and get value to then work on the next. So impact mapping is an approach to do that. So here are a few examples of some stories. Who uses stories here? You said you write user stories, right? Who writes the user stories?
Usually the business area. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
What if the team were working on the product and they found a bug or an issue or something that's just not right and needs fixing? Who would write the story then?
Manifesto.
Yeah.
Anyone can basically.
Bingo. Yeah. So it becomes a default that the BA or the product owner ends up writing many, if not most, of the stories. But bear in mind, anybody can write a story. And what I've done with a number of clients, you see this is just on an index card here. I prefer using physical cards. Yeah.
So the reason I said business here was that a lot of times in the ABS, the business owner, business tester,
Yeah.
everyone is exactly the same.
Oh, well, that's even better, right? But that's okay. But the message I was trying to convey is that anybody can write a user story. And a trick I've had is, you can see this is an index card here. The last few banks I've worked at, I got one of the graphic designers to rustle up a card with a banking logo, and it had the as I want to, so that, and then Windows here, you brand it all up. And on the back, the acceptance criteria, a little circle here for the size. And then I'd print tens of thousands of them in one big bulk before I get caught and they say we can't buy them again. And then we give people pads everywhere. And then I pride myself because you see scrum boards everywhere with these cards on. And the thing is, it means it becomes more prolific. If you've got an idea, put it on a story card. So, the general format of user stories, and by the way, user stories are not the only way to capture requirements for Agile teams. It's just becoming de facto the most common way. But you have, as a role, I want to do something so that to achieve a valuable outcome. So, for example, as a frequent flyer, I want to be able to see my points balance so that it's clear that I can use it to pay my ticket. And then you would also have the acceptance criteria on the back. You may have specific assumptions. You may have where it came from, so who wrote this story, whose idea is it. You may want to code the story or link it to if you've got a Jira ticket. And the size, you may even have the business value on there. So you capture lots of information on this. What's important not to do is think of this as a requirements document that you're chopping into cards, into stories. These are not requirements. They're not a proxy for requirements. What they are is a promise of a future conversation. And the idea is that the people doing the work talk about this card and become aligned and have common understanding of what it means. So, and then it's still in the short-term memory because they do the work straight away. The old way of working is you'd have hundreds and hundreds of pages of business requirements documents, and then they'd get emailed around, and people would read them and miss the context and forget things. And then half of it, you'd spend so much time on it, it becomes redundant anyway. What we're trying to do here, remember, working software over comprehensive documentation. This is seen as minimal documentation. I believe you'd still have a technical requirement spec, you'd still have other specifications, but they would emerge with the work, and they may refer to the stories themselves. There are some companies, including banks, who use these for auditing purposes, so they actually store these as the requirements. But these don't replace a requirements document. So the 3 C's of a story: card, conversation, and it says confirmation here. I've also heard it called conditions. So this Ron Jeffries built up user stories, devised user stories in, I think, 1999, so 17 years ago now. And that was before the Agile manifesto, and it was in XP, Extreme Programming, that it was used. And what we're saying is we'll have a card, a physical card. And I know ABS, right, you generally use Jira, but this is the advice. The important thing is the conversation between the team and the customer representatives, and between the team and each other, and more importantly, between the product owner and the team. Hello.
Sorry, we just got a question online. It's going to be related to something that happened a couple of minutes ago because we've got this delay. Comment from Tony. Using Jira, he said he finds it better for the Jira title to be the do something than to put the full story in the description. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, brilliant idea. And in fact, with the story cards that we have the template, I would have a title on there as well. So let's say, where is it? On this, oh, by the way, I apologize, I think there's a 20 or 30 second lag, so it's going to confuse everyone watching this now. So yes, you'd have a title. So that frequent flyer booking card that we need to do, and so the Jira title would be frequent flyer booking. And what happens is the neurons will fire, and you'll think, oh yeah, frequent flyer booking, and straight away, in your short-term memory, we'll have all of the richness of the conversations you've had. So yeah, a title is good. Jira has codes as well. So yes, I would have a title here. Good point, whoever said that, thank you. So yeah, the 3 C's. The card, the physical card, the conversation, this is the important thing because it's interactions, individuals and interactions, and we wanted that richness of face-to-face communication. And finally, the confirmation. This is the acceptance criteria. And in an acceptance criteria as well, I tend to exclude things, because we want to try and keep the story small. So if you're explicitly going to exclude an element, you put it in there, so there's no misunderstanding. And the criteria to determine when the implementation is complete. This is different from definition of done, which you would have heard of. Definition of done is an overarching understanding of any user story, or in most cases, user stories, we agree they're done when. So, you know, when the code's done, when we've done the documentation, when the stakeholders are signed off, that kind of stuff. The acceptance criteria is less generic, it's specific to the story. So remember the 3 C's, and you can't go far wrong with a user story. And it has to be lightweight. In fact, the worst thing a story can be is really detailed. If a team sees a user story all nice and tidy, lots of explicit details, and on the back, you know, lots of acceptance criteria, they're going to naturally assume that the product owner or the BA who's written this has thought about everything, and they can't have. So it's better if it's lightweight and it's an emerging document that people have the conversation. So better doesn't necessarily mean better with user stories. So they describe the functionality. They're describing the outcome and the impact we're having for a person. Now that person, by the way, if we go back to the user, just go here, that role, we ideally want an end user, a real customer, a client. But it is acceptable, at least the way I practice Agile, to have as a Scrum team member or as a business analyst or as a developer. Be careful though, because if you look at a Scrum board and every story says, as a product owner I want this, then as a product owner I want that, and I've seen that, that's a bad sign. But it's okay to say, as a product owner I want to know more about this problem so we can adequately create value. And that would be a business analysis spike. And the way the team would achieve that would be spending half a day to really nut into that. And that's a valid thing to do. It's a promise to have one or more conversations later, deferring the detail closer to the time when we'll act on it, keeping it fresh in mind. So it happens during backlog refinement. You would want to get to the point where it's ready to be pulled into the sprints, maybe the week or so before. And then even in sprint planning, I would go through the detail again. And my approach is to estimate the size in sprint planning. That's the last responsible moment. And I mentioned definition of ready. Every story, the team, they had a definition of done, but they'd also have a definition of ready. And this is a checkpoint that the team will not pull work in unless it meets invest. And anything else that they agree they won't pull in until it's ready. So invest stands for independence. That means you can finish that story without having to finish another story or waiting for another story. It's negotiable, and that's because you want to continue to have those conversations. To a degree, even after you've pulled it into the sprint, you could have assumptions in there, or you could go back to the product owner the day later and say, we thought this story would be quite straightforward. We've looked at it. It's a bit gnarlier than we thought. Can we shave off a few things? You've got to be careful that you don't do that 10 minutes before the sprint review. But if it's early on, it's a pragmatic thing to do. So you're continually having those conversations and you're clarifying with the product owner. We've looked at it again. We thought, we've got payments here. Do you mean Visa? Do you mean PayPal? Can you just tell me what you mean there? So you're continually having these conversations. And so it's negotiable. Valuable, you want real value. And again, this is a real customer or a real client, even if it's internal. It could be knowledge value, and this is where the spikes come in. So the outcome of the story could be that you learn something so you can create new user stories. So it's either business value or knowledge value. Estimable, there's no point a team pulling work in unless they can estimate it. However, if you're explicit in the sprint planning, the team could say, well, we need to get started on this, but we're not sure, because if we go through route A, it's going to be quite difficult. Route B is easy. We don't know if we can go one way or the other. So what you could do is say, well, we'll estimate it on the easiest, and if it's the harder one, we'll come back to you and let you know. And that's the way I would do it, actually. I'd estimate on the best case, and then as soon as you know it's not the best case, be transparent. Which seems like you're setting yourself up to fail, but that's the intent. You want to fail, because then you learn. You learn more acutely if you'd have estimated on the best case. If you estimate on worst case and you also have caveats and buffers, you'll tend to consume them. So I generally estimate on the best case. But you need to be able to estimate at least in broad terms. If you have no idea at all, is this bigger than Ben-Hur or is it a 5-minute job? Then the team is well within the rights to say, we won't pull this in until we're ready. So we need to do some more refinement. Small. Of all of these, this is the one which is not negotiable, if you will. There is no point pulling a story in if you know you can't finish it, or if there's any risk that you can't finish it at the end of the sprint. As a rule of thumb, I would suggest less than half a sprint. Many teams, the high-performing teams I've worked with, the biggest problem they've had is pulling in stories that they thought were small, and then they failed the sprint because it was a lot bigger. There was lots of things that they didn't consider. And that's okay, because by failing the sprint, it makes it clear, makes it transparent, and we learn from it. So one team in particular, one story took 5 sprints. because they kept just not being able to finish it. But over time, they says, well, what can we do better in the future? How can we make stories easier to finish in future? And they became a really high-performing team. And it was only, I believe, because of that failure. So failure is a good thing in that context. So small, you have to be small. And finally, testable. And when I say testable, in a technology standpoint, it means running tests, user acceptance tests, system acceptance tests, all the way through as much as you can. In practice, it means you may have to have different environments. But if it's testable, it's ideal. In a non-IT environment, it may just be demonstrable. There was a case once, there was a mechanical company, they do medical equipment, and they have software and hardware. And this product needed to be waterproof. And what they did in the sprint review at the end is they demonstrated it to be waterproof by showing a hose at it. But you wouldn't do that in a meeting room, right? So what they did is they did the test, videoed the test, and then showed the video at the review. And said, well, here's the test we ran, here's the data, we can demonstrate that it's waterproof. So that's what we mean by testable. And remember, this has to happen in the sprint, so it's only a few weeks. So this is the challenge of keeping stories quite small.
Gareth, I have a question about user stories.
Yeah.
Yeah. What are your views on user stories and getting non-functional requirement type things reflected in there, or routine tasks such as like access to a dev environment or something like that?
Good question. So non-functional requirements. There's another slide that covers it slightly, but I'll talk to it now. You're talking about scalability, reliability, security, compliance, and all those kind of things. You may have some of them explicit in the definition of done. You may include it in the acceptance criteria. It's okay to have a user story that says, as a tester, I want a test environment in the following sprint so that I can adequately test future stories. And then there's value. It's not direct value to the customer, but there's indirect value by having the team work better. So you could have stories which encapsulate work that the team are doing to bootstrap themselves. That's, by the way, my approach. I know other teams have what's known as a sprint zero, and they spend the whole sprint just setting up environments and all that. My mindset, and by the way, it's also Ken Schwaber's, who's the architect of Scrum, is you go into the first sprint with the endeavour of delivering some value to a customer, but also, so at least one item of value to the customer, but then also you have the other stories which encapsulate all of the infrastructure, architecture, requirements analysis, environments, all that kind of stuff. I'm not sure if I've answered all of the question well. Is that okay for you?
Yeah, I have been in situations where I have been asked to write a user story in the format of, as a developer, I would like to have access to this test environment so that I can do my work. And I'm just wondering, like, how do you draw the line between when to, using that format versus when that format may not apply to what you want to do?
I like to have every story. Just my approach, right? It's not the only way to do it. I like to have every piece of work that goes into the sprint as a user story, because it causes you to have those conversations. It challenges you to ensure there's value, and there is value there, right? Yeah. And then you can go through the process. And remember the shoe state? You just get used to estimating the same way. It just becomes second nature. So if you read the Scrum guide, it says product backlog items. So theoretically, you could have use cases and spikes and all of those kind of things. But the teams I coach, I generally call them all to be user stories. The caveat I'd say is beware that if you have a whole sprint and it says, as a tester I want this and as a developer I want that, then for a team of 6, the cost is upwards of $80,000. And you've got to ask yourself, with that 80 grand we spent in that sprint, what customer value have we got? So we want to try and aspire to get some kind of return on all of the work we do. But there's no black and white answer, right? So it's a balancing act. And it comes with just getting to the heart state and getting used to it.
Yeah, because if you look at the blogosphere, there seems to be a difference of opinion between a lot of high-profile people, Jeff Patton, Mike Cohen, Agile and Roman Pickler, and they all say different things about that. So I was just wondering.
Yeah, they do. You're right. This is live. I don't know who I'm talking to now. I'll say what I think. This is a problem with the Agile community because it's almost like Christianity, right, and Judaism. It all came from the same place, and they've all gone off in different directions, and now they're having a go at each other. Almost like that. So everybody's very smart and thinking about it in their own context. So, for example, you know how I said estimate in the sprint planning? The last bank I was working at, one of the other Agile coaches there, who I really, really respect, he came into one of my sprint planning and he said, oh, don't you do the estimating in refinement? I said, no, the last responsible moment. That's how I've been coached, by somebody who knows what he's talking about. And then we had this conversation on Yammer, and there's a split straight down the middle. So some Agile coaches will say, no, do your planning poker in refinement. And in fact, the software training says that. But my approach is do it as late as possible, for good reason. So this is the problem at the moment, because Agile is an emerging approach, and there's no single way to do Agile. You'll find, Mike Cohen, Jeff Patton, Jeff Sutherland, Dave Snowden, and Don Reinertsen, and there's another guy, Dean Leffingwell. All of these thought leaders are always online in the blogosphere, having open and engaging discussions. And I've got my way of doing it, right? But I think we're all open to change the way we think. So I think my answer is, I'll share my experience, and then you find out what works for you. And if I was in a team the team pushed back on me, and they were mature enough to say, look, we want to do estimating and refinement, I'd say, yeah, that's fine. So, invest. Look at these stories here. That one on the top left. As a passenger, I want to see all links to all details of every flight so I can decide where to go. Does that meet invest? Or I'll ask it a different way. Why doesn't this meet invest? How many flights have we got going? Yeah, how many flights in the world at the moment? So it may be better to say, as a Qantas passenger, I want to see all Qantas flights out of Canberra this week, or on this Friday. Then you can narrow it down. And so, not even just this Friday, even if you just limit it to Qantas and not Virgin Australia and all that. Yep. Exactly, right? Yeah, and this is the conversations we'd have, and I'd go, good point. Just domestic, because the security with national, and it makes it harder and all that kind of stuff, passports. How about the bottom one? As a product manager, I want to update a trip summary so I can assure it's up-to-date and accurate. What's wrong with that? Say again?
It's very vague.
It's vague, yeah. Also, it's obvious. That is obvious. It's like, I want this, so I've got this. It doesn't give you a real reason. It's quite woolly. It's very, very vague. You're right. How about the next one? As a sales associate, I want to see a list of all trips on specific routes where I can select a trip to see its details, so that I can see the details about a trip for which I can provide a quote.
Seems specific.
It is specific, yeah. But I think we could have 3 independent stories out of that.
Yeah, this is what we do.
Yeah, and this is the small being the hardest thing of user stories, is making them small. And so, how would we split that up? Well, you could view the trips as one story, you can select the trips as another story, and then see the details of the trip as a third. So it comes with time. So many things in Agile, I can coach people and say, this is how to do it. It's just like a cookbook, Stories is something, it's like a black art, and all I can do is give guidance, and does it meet this criteria? And over time, teams form and emerge their own way of writing stories. It is so hard. I mean, for me personally, this is the hardest part of Agile. I think this is harder than the scaling challenges that most companies have. So, we've talked about all of this already. So the placeholders for requirements, they come from the usual sources: workshops, observations, research, sketch prototypes, questionnaires, interviews, observations. All of these things here can come from things like design thinking. Have you heard of design thinking? Bernice, we're talking about user-centered design. So observing how people are using the current product, how can we make their life better? Could come from, there's a technique or a thought called Lean Startup. There's a book called Lean Startup. And in that, you generally have a low-cost prototype, test to the market, and then get the feedback. And their mantra is think it, build it, ship it, tweak it. So you would think very lightweight, what can we test the market with to get some more validated learning? And human interactions. What isn't on there is focus groups, I hope. And the reason is, if you go and ask a bunch of people what they're going to do, firstly they'll say, I'm going to stop smoking, lose some weight and go to the gym after Christmas. And also they're going to say, I'm going to spend money on that, but when you actually ask them to spend money on it, they may not. If people explain the behaviour, it's different because people always make emotional decisions, not logical ones. So there's no point asking for their logical interpretation. It's better to observe how people work. And this is leading into another phrase. I'm banding around lots of buzzwords here, and you can Google any of them, is lean UX, user experience, lean user experience, and finding out how people behave, how they respond to your product, and how you can impact them, which is the next one. Crafting an excellent user experience, simplicity. It's all about simplicity and iterating and evolving a product. You'll see on the right there's a picture of a low-fidelity prototype. So don't spend weeks and months on a HTML page to observe how people click. Get a few people in front of a bit of paper with post-it notes and get them to press the post-it notes. So press login and then see the flow and see how they work. That's an initial prototype way of getting fast feedback, and it's really, really low cost. Get out of the building, go and see people for yourself, go and meet people. Some of the most successful projects I've had, we've actually had real customers, this is in the banking sector, come in and talk to us about their own experience. There's one case, it was an accounts package, accountancy link-up. So at ASB, you make your credit card transaction and it feeds all the way through to zero through the cloud. And obviously there's some security things going on there. But we had some marketing consultants go to small business accountants to see how they work. And they took a few pictures, and then they did a bit of a PowerPoint, which I know is a bit old school, and they presented it to loads of general managers and the whole team and the product owner. And somebody said, oh, hold on a minute, that accountant there, what's that on her desk? And she had this big bundle of tags. Do you have them here in the bank, the little key tags, to give you the encrypted code to log in? You know what I mean, though. You have these little time tags, and it gives you an 8-digit number, and you dial in. What these small business owners had done is said to the accountant, look, this is too hard for me. There's my tag. You just deal with it. And the accountant had, obviously, 20 or 30 different clients, and they had them on a big chain, on a big ring. Now, as a bank, do you see that as a bit of a security risk? So what would be easier? Well, how about we give the accountants the authority? Just a one-page sign off the accountants so they have authority to view your bank details. And that solves what is a huge gaping hole in the security of the bank. So it was a left field view of what they'd been working on. That wasn't part of the product, but they looked at that and thought, oh yeah, we've got to change that. So we talked through the user experience. Another project I was on was credit card application, and we would actually be mystery shoppers. We'd go into the bank and apply for credit cards for the laugh of it, and we'd go through the whole process to see what were the pain points, what was taking long, what was difficult, what was the experience. And from that, we actually mapped out a whole customer journey and said, this is the hardest part, so this is the thing we can fix. This is the easiest way to make some impact for the customer. So this is Lean UX. So you've got your stories, you've done your research, you've had your refinement, you've written loads of stories, and you've ended up with quite a few. And we've talked about impact mapping already, and I mentioned Moscow. By the way, who here has been on the Agile Fundamentals course? Many of you. So this will just be a refresher for you, right? So you remember you did this, the must have, could have, should have, won't have. And the idea out of this is great because it causes the product owner to have that real thought experiment. Do we really need this or not? And what you're trying to do is create that minimum viable product. So what we do is, for those who haven't been on the course, we get all of the cards and we group them in. This card, we just must have it. There's no debating it. This card, we should have it, but if we don't, it's not the end of the world. If we've got time, we do this could, and that one, kill it. A bad sign, of course, is a product owner who says, all of these cards, just must have them all. And back in August, I was with a company in Northland where that happened. The product owner says, we've got this problem, we've got a fixed date for a boat show, we need to do this app for this product we've got, and we just need all of these things. But we went through the Moscow process and created a story map. And initially, it was weighted towards lots of must-haves, but then a few days later, he scratched his head and said, you know, I'd rather have something at the boat show than everything not done. So and it was making it easier for him to have that decision to drop things off. So it's a really powerful way to work out what your MVP is. We've got 15 minutes to go, so we're close to Q&A at the end. I wasn't sure how the time would go. It's going well. Are you happy with the pace? Good? Cool. So feature planning. So we've talked about this. Feature, epic, and... No, we haven't actually. Features, epics, and stories. So this is a hierarchy. We've talked about the stories being roughly half a sprint or less. So an epic is when it's too big to be a single story, but maybe you could group a few stories together in something which is larger. And a feature is something which a real customer would recognize, something meaningful to a customer. And that's the language I use. There are different languages depending on different people, and all of those thought leaders I was telling you about, they have feature, epic, story, epic, feature, story, activity, task, story. There's no right or wrong way. My only advice is be consistent. John?
Just another question from online. Do we do Moscow on a per iteration or release basis?
Per release basis. So in an iteration, anything you pull in, theoretically, you intend to finish. That doesn't always happen. Especially the highest performing teams, it rarely happens actually, because they're always pushing themselves. But they get most of it done and they focus on the most valuable things first. So Moscow is really a technique for when you're at this level. We've got these features here, and we've got these epics, and we want to say, well, these first 3 epics, we really need those. That one, you know, if you're going to tell me we're going to run out of time, that's the one I want to kill. So that's the way of giving some level of negotiation to the scope. So the scope becomes negotiable. And remember, responding to changeover following a plan. We want to change our mindset to be able to do that. So this is just a way of grouping them together in a hierarchy. And here's an example of a story map and what it would look like. And like I say, typically I would use physical cards and physical boards. Personally as well, I would colour code them. So you would see if there was a certain theme on the stories, they would have a certain visualization. So it's just easy to see. So maybe all the red ones are MVP, for example. There you go. So all the design considerations. This it includes your non-functional requirements, Bernie. So the most important quality attributes for the system: performance, throughput, scalability, reliability, resilience, maintainability, and all those other things. Just remember, just enough and just in time. If you learn nothing else today, it's the last responsible moment and barely adequate documentation. And this is the last slide. So I'd warmly advise you to look at jeffpattanassociates.com. He's got loads of blogs. Seems like some of you have already been on them. Impactmapping.org. Mike Cohn, who you mentioned, is mountinggoatsoftware.com, which is really interesting. And between them, they've got a few books out as well. So Jeff Patton's got a book on story mapping, Mike Cohn on user story and requirements gathering. And these people, are, you know, they've been doing this for a long time, and they've got a lot of value to add. And hey, what's a PowerPoint without a Dilbert? So, 10 minutes to go. Do you have any other questions, or is there any to Skype in? Yeah. Hello. Yes.
while I really like whiteboards and post-its for mocking up and being informal, we are supposed to sort of keep records and sometimes have to collaborate with people in other areas. Are there any sort of good software tools that preserve the informality?
My favourite joke of the week. The best tool for distributed teams is a Boeing 737. I love that joke. Yeah, I accept. You've got distributed teams. In that case, use Jira. You need to audit and track your work. Definitely use Jira. If and when you've got people working together in the same space, my advice is to use physical boards and Jira. Now, you're going to say, well, that's a waste of time, it's doubling up. It is, but the benefit far outweighs the cost. So the fact you've got a physical board means that you've got the tickets and you're face-to-face, and that's the way we've evolved for millions of years to the way we work, the way we think. But we do need, with distributed teams and with the need to meet compliance and audit, we do need to record it. So there was a case in Standard Bank in South Africa where the CIO said, I will pay for every Scrum meeting you have to pay to have somebody as a scribe doing the documentation in the background, but you're going to be there on physical boards. And then that happens anyway, and I'll pay for that. Because the cost of somebody just typing it in, a few grand, a $80,000 sprint team not being effective is a far bigger issue. So I would so strongly recommend using physical boards. And I know there's issues of OSH and boards everywhere and all that kind of stuff. I know it's a challenge. I'm just sharing with you what is when you get the best outcome is when you have the physical boards. Any more? Wow. I've either overwhelmed you or answered all your questions, or it's 12:30, 1:30. Yep.
So this goes back to the user story mapping technique you mentioned, where people, organise their stories according to features. How does that tie in with like the sprint planning that happens afterwards? So I'm assuming that with user story mapping, you carve out the stories you would have for your minimum viable product, and then with sprint planning, what usually happens is that the team comes together just beforehand to prioritise the stories they're going to work on in that sprint. So have you already got those stories defined, as part of your minimum viable product? How does that then lead into, picking prioritising the stories for the upcoming sprints if you've already, know which ones are in your minimum viable product?
So this is the importance of invest and definition of ready. And so when you're story mapping and you're impact mapping and you're doing all of these analysis things, the pre-planning before it goes into the sprint, it's to get to the story to the point where it's okay to pull it in. Sprint planning is the point at which you talk in more detail. So for a 2-week sprint, let's say I've got a team of 6, 2-week sprint, I would spend 4 hours in sprint planning on the first day. And that sprint planning is split into 2 hours doing the what and 2 hours doing the how. So the what is which stories we're pulling in and why to set the sprint goal, and then the how is the team breaking it down into tasks. In the first 2 hours, we spend 20 minutes setting the scene, what we agreed in the retrospective, how do you feel today, all that kind of stuff. So I generally spend about an hour, and we go through each story, and a team would pull in between 6 and 10 stories. I would spend 10 to 15 minutes per story, roughly, having detailed discussion of what do you mean by this product owner? Does it mean this? Do you include this? Can you exclude that? At that point, they estimate it, and when the team have agreed the size, then we just park it, and then later on we get into breaking it down into tasks. So if you go into a sprint planning and you've done none of the upfront Moscow and requirements and invest and all of that, it's really difficult to get to the right level of granularity for the team to be able to do the work and know what the business wants. So you do need that upfront work. And that's why the Scrum Guide tells you 10% of your time in a sprint is spent refinement for stories for future sprints. Story mapping and impact mapping generally is before you start, or maybe once every 3 months when you're looking at big features. And then, when you're doing the story mapping and stuff, really, you only need the level of granularity for the next sprint or two. So you may have your Moscow and you may have all of the story map out, but only the MVP, which the MVP may be 3 months of work. You may only have 6 weeks worth of work, so that's 10 cards, which you actually drill into the detail. You don't need all of the MVP totally detailed out. And this is because if you spend time now thinking about all the whys and wherefores of a card, firstly, you may never even do it, so that was a waste of money. And secondly, by the time you do it, you've forgotten about it. And this is the reason we reduce the amount of documentation we do, because it's still fresh in our memory. And it's the conversations which count. Does that help?
Yeah, that's helpful.
So probably a few Skype questions for you.
Yeah, I've got another one here. The question is, shall Jira stories be in user story format? Is that highly recommended or not?
So the last time I used Jira in anger was back in 2012, and it wasn't very Agile friendly at the time. And it was a telco in Auckland, but they had customers all over the world, so it made sense to use Jira. What we ended up doing was printing off the Jira ticket to put on the Scrum board, which I know I've seen a few teams do here, by the way. I'm neutral on that, I'll be honest. On the one hand, I would say yes, but on the other hand, it can be quite wasteful. So what I would generally do is have the Jira tickets at the high level, and then we say, well, just with the title, the code, and what it's for, and maybe a few acceptance criteria. When it gets to a point where we're going to be pulling it into a sprint, as part of the refinement, I would then transfer it to a card, and that's when I would format it as a proper user story with acceptance criteria, and maybe at the end we'd capture it in quality center or something. So I wouldn't demand one way or the other. I'd leave it to the team to work out. But I don't think I would. But if you're only using Jira, maybe you might want to. You've probably got to go. There's 2 minutes to go, right? Yeah. All right. Any more?
No more online.
No more. Thank you. I hope this was valuable. So back in a few weeks' time, I'm going to do more on sprint planning, the daily stand-up reviews and retrospectives, and that's just the way to do Scrum. Don't forget it's about being Agile, not doing Agile. As you can tell, I enjoy doing this kind of stuff, so I look forward to the next one. More importantly, tell your friends, and anybody got any feedback, email me personally or John, and I'd love to hear feedback from people who are watching remotely. I didn't use the whiteboard today because that crashed and burned yesterday a little bit.
Thank you.
Thank you.